Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Luke.
Glory to you, Lord Christ.
Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not, because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him, because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble and said, "He has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner." Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, "Look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much." Then Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Today I'd like to talk a bit about transgressive acts and the untold story. What's the connection between the two? Well, every human life is inscribed by boundaries, some beyond our control, and some we make ourselves. We spend a lot of time navigating boundaries, discovering where they lay, being surprised by them, pushing them, discerning whether a given boundary is worth crossing in this place at this time. Most of this boundary business is of little significance. Do I break the boundary of habit, for instance, and try that new dry cleaners after the lady at the old one was rude for the 3rd time? Sometimes, though, the boundaries we decide to break have consequences, big consequences. Sometimes a single transgressive step, a word spoken, a glance exchanged, a hand clasped, can change everything and make all the difference. Because when we cross boundaries, one thing that is absolutely sure to happen, for better or worse, is that our view of the world and the place where we find ourselves is going to change. This is the reason why the more clearly delineated the boundary, the more deeply ingrained the sanction by tradition or custom or law against crossing it, the scarier the prospect of crossing it is going to appear. What if that view from the other side isn't what we imagined? What if we decide we don't like it over there and there's no way back? After all, frontiers have a funny way of closing when you least expect it. And suddenly, you might find yourself in no man's land, a refugee, stuck in between belonging and nowhere, with no one at all. Today's readings deal with this very human conundrum, a very specifically American conundrum as well, woven into the fabric of our nation's identity. Are we satisfied with being dissatisfied, or do we strike out and try our hand at something risky and new? When I was considering how I'd like to approach what the readings have to say to us this Sunday, it occurred to me that as a woman who was brought up and lived most of her life in the Catholic Church, the very act of standing here before you in this pulpit is quite the transgressive act. It's something that I can't quite believe that I'm doing, to be honest. In the back of my mind, and I'm sure if Luigi's here or listening, he will sympathize with this, I hear the Catholic conscience that takes the form of a nun, who was our grammar school librarian, Sister Louise A. May, from whose wizened little habit-wearing body boomed a blood-curdling voice. "Just what do you think you're doing, young lady?" Usually, when she caught me, a second or third grader, trying to sneak books off the shelves of the upper school section. Very transgressive books, of course, like Hamilton's Greek Myths for Young People, Flowers in the Attic, or anything by Judy Blume. But anyway, here I am. The first time Father Bill asked me, that big little voice of the good sister in my head was my initial reaction. There's no way, I don't belong there, and what are the people at St. Anna's? They don't have any interest in what I have to say anyway. But then, there was something else, a little steadier and a little less shrill, that began to drown out that first protest with a question. Given this invitation, this opening in the frontier, where will you be more of yourself that Sunday? In the pew or in the pulpit? So here I am, and I can tell you the view from this side looks very different indeed. I think this little interior conversation tells us a lot about the power of transgressive acts. First, it shows us that, as for Zacchaeus, the frontiers we cross are often arranged or dictated by forces outside of ourselves, but they are often, quite as often, reinforced from within. After all, I'm in an Episcopal church now. There's no one gatekeeping women at the altar, and the only gatekeeping preventing me from taking up this invitation is the one inside myself. Second, it gives us a glimpse, of which Jesus will shortly give us much more, about why frontiers are so frightening. What would change if a woman gets up and starts explicating the gospel instead of a man? The view. Maybe she transmits experiences that resonate in different ways, that bear insights previously unrepresented, and that carries the risk of forcing us to see things in a different way. That's always a frightening prospect. All of a sudden, here is somebody with a different set of eyes telling a hitherto untold part of the story. Homilists are always talking about the importance of the pericope, aren't they? The view around the selected reading that seeks to put it in context, not only with what comes after and before in the text, but also in the sense of exegesis or explanation of time and place, in writer's intention, etc., etc. All the things that we can, with the help of modern scholars and archaeologists, at least make a stab at trying to understand. But what about the part of the story that doesn't get told? That doesn't even make it to the text, that lies beyond the boundary of knowability. Just because they don't see you doesn't mean you're not there. So much of women's stories have ended up on the biblical cutting room floor, and the ones that remain are usually trimmed to the tastes of a decidedly male director. For instance, what if Zacchaeus has a spouse, a wife? We certainly don't hear from her. Now, maybe her reaction to all this isn't central to her husband's story from a Christian teaching perspective, but you can guarantee that it was pretty darn central to the quality of his life that afternoon. I mean, it's the end of another harried housewife, multitasking mom day. Finally, a little peace and quiet, and here comes Zacchaeus. Hey, babe. Oh, by the way, you know that mega famous preacher, Jesus of Nazareth? He invited himself to dinner. I didn't think you'd mind. Oh, and probably 12 of his best friends, too. I have a fairly good idea that her reactions are going to be some first century Palestine version of the following. Number 1, you did what? Number 2, well, you can tell Mr. Mega Famous Jesus of Nazareth and his 12 best friends that they're gonna have to be satisfied with frozen pizza from Robert's because it's Friday night and I'm not cooking. And that is not even mentioning her reaction when he tells her he's given half their stuff to the poor. But of course, we never hear that part of the story. Do you ever wonder just how much of that world of Jesus and his stories we don't see? What do we do with that? As a history teacher, I get this question a lot. What about all the stuff we don't know? How can we ever know what really happened and why? Well, the answer is, of course, we can't. We can't know all those hidden parts exactly as they were, but we can be aware. We can recognize that they existed, that they were cut or buried for a reason, and we can try to find out why. And just because we can't know all the details, it doesn't mean we can't remember that there were other stories and other visions from other viewpoints that have been lost. It doesn't mean we should stop looking, because sometimes, just when we've decided there's an irremediable limitation to our understanding, to our ways of doing or being in the world, something happens. Some unexpected vistas open up, and an invitation falls to our lap to cross the line, to look again, and to see. Luke is characteristically blunt about Zacchaeus. He was rich, and he was a tax collector. And not just any tax collector, he was the chief. What does that mean? In Luke's world, these two go together, and they're meant to stoke our outrage in the reader for that type of person in any age that we love to hate. Someone who grows fat on unearned privilege. In the Roman Empire, local tax collectors operated along the lines of their ultimate masters, the provincial governors. Each one of those was a mini despot for his term, who owed Rome a set percentage of the province's wealth and was free to skim whatever he could get off the top, by any means short of inciting rebellion. Roman taxes were pretty low by our standards, in single digits, but hiked up several times at different levels until when you get to somebody like Zacchaeus, his percentage of the take added on to a poor person's tax bill, unlike most of ours, might mean the difference between health and malnutrition, home and homelessness, freedom or slavery. So, he was not a beloved character. Plus, he's short. We might be forgiven for thinking at this point, oh God, come on, Luke. Really? Aren't you laying it on a bit thick? What's next? Dirty fingernails? Too much aftershave? Crow's feet? We get it. He's got all kinds of limitations, inside and out. But that's exactly where we'd be mistaken, because it is Zacchaeus' glorious, infuriating limitations that are the centerpiece of this marvelous story. 10 little verses that turn the world upside down. For it is precisely his imperfections, his littleness, that make him dissatisfied with his place in the crowd and force him to seek out a new place. Because Zacchaeus wants to see. Zacchaeus was trying to see who Jesus was. It's a devastating line. Luke has just set us up to hate this guy, and then he tells us what he wanted is the very same thing as the rest of us. He wants this so much, in fact, that he did an extraordinary thing, the very last thing that most of us in our self-seriousness would think of doing. He made himself vulnerable in a way that's hard not to see through the eyes of the crowd around him, as someone outrageous or ridiculous, or both. By running ahead and climbing that sycamore tree, Zacchaeus accepts his own limitations, both inside and out. Something in him wants to see Jesus, just see him. This man about whom so much has been said, whose words and deeds perhaps speak to a hidden part of Zacchaeus that's been obscured by the smut and the falsity of the life he's lived. He's small, but he wants to be bigger. Therefore, he's going to climb this tree, an act that most of us relegate to childhood follies. And now, not only can he see, but he can be seen. And that is the other scary, inevitable thing about crossing boundaries. We see things, we hear things, and discover things we didn't know before, but we're in an unfamiliar place. We risk being exposed and perhaps ridiculed and rejected. We can be seen by people who had no idea of who we were and what we were looking for now. What if people see me? people who know me? What if people see me who know my mother? What if I'm humiliated or ignored? What if whatever or whoever I find is not what I'm looking for? Is it worth it, that kind of vulnerability? That moment of hovering at the foot of the sycamore tree. Is my desire for a different view, for a different life, stronger than my fears? What if in the end it's for nothing, and Jesus doesn't come down this way at all? But here, the big man in town recognizes his essential littleness. He's descended from the artificial heights that power and wealth provide, and he realizes, I'm just a little guy who can't see. Surely he could have ordered someone to push away through the crowd right up to the front to see Jesus. But Zacchaeus suddenly divines that this seeing requires a different strength than the kind the world recognizes. It needs the strength to know ourselves for who we are, a person of limitations, yes, but also of desires, for goodness, wholeness, for something better and higher than what we have. And then it demands the strength to do something about it. In the case of Zacchaeus, that means to shed his dignity and privilege and risk making a fool of himself before all the people he's bullied and before all the people he looks up to be real and honest for once about his desire to see. It is in this place where Zacchaeus is at his emptiest, his smallest, and his most extravagantly vulnerable. Every single security, even the ground beneath his feet stripped away, that he and Jesus finally meet one another. This is the moment where Jesus performs a transgressive act of his own. It's an old habit of his, making a teacher out of the student. And in this case, that just happens to be our frenemy, Zacchaeus, the guy we love to hate. For Jesus is the master of crossing boundaries. Jesus looked up at him and said, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I have to stay at your house today. Jesus doesn't miss a beat. No, he goes right up to Zacchaeus, looking silly up there in his tree. But Jesus' response is no mockery. No. In fact, he transgresses one more boundary, one more social norm. Not only does he not judge this ignominious figure, this sinner, as the crowd grumbles, Jesus bestows on him a signal honor. Jesus asks of Zacchaeus his hospitality, or philoxenia, the care for strangers, which in the ancient world was much more about the giver and much less about the guest. It was a way for the host to show off, to gain honor and respect, to bind guest to host by obligation for his kindness. It is Jesus saying, you so-called big man, by recognizing your littleness, your merit being exalted in a way that far exceeds whatever fate and society have bestowed upon you, you've earned the right to play host to God. In 10 lines, human expectations, human preoccupations, human judgment about greatness and smallness, vision and desire, all of that is promptly demolished. Significantly, this transgressive request of Jesus doesn't occur in a whisper. There's nothing discreet about it at all. It happens right out loud in front of everybody. Not only has Jesus affirmed Zacchaeus' desire to see anew, to be anew, he tells him, come down and take me home. You've put yourself at risk to see, and therefore I've chosen you above everybody else here. And not only do I say that you belong here with me, among my followers, in your littleness, but tonight, your home will be my home too. Imagine that. Zacchaeus meets his wife at the door. Sweetheart, today I've made a fool of myself. I've ignored all the expectations. I've ruined my chances. And once, just for once, I was only myself. I lost all the trappings. And like an idiot, I climbed a tree. And our life will never be the same. But look what I've brought home with me. The light of the world. Jesus understands, and perhaps after that evening, reclining together with him at table, Zacchaeus also understood the great reward of taking the risk, of crossing the frontier, of putting ourselves out there is to see a little more like God sees, not just from our side or from the other side, but from all the sides. And in so doing, to catch perhaps a few more words of the great untold story.